When Resident Evil Veronica was first announced, many of us expected a fairly straightforward remake, a modernized version of Code Veronica with better graphics, updated gameplay, and a few story tweaks along the way. But after Capcom's latest interviews, that doesn't seem to be the case at all, because they've now confirmed major changes to the story, a much bigger focus on Claire, expanded lore surrounding Rockfort Island, and new connections to the future of the Resident Evil timeline. And perhaps most interestingly, they've revealed the core theme driving this entire remake. In fact, the more Capcom talks about Veronica, the more it sounds like they're doing something far more ambitious than simply remaking an old game. They're completely reimagining it. So today, let's break down the biggest revelations from these new interviews and discuss what they could mean for Resident Evil Veronica. One of the biggest takeaways from these interviews is that Capcom seems to be approaching Veronica very differently from their previous remakes. When asked about the game's story, producer Yoshiaki confirmed that this remake will feature major changes to the narrative, characters, and overall structure of the original game. And honestly, that statement alone is kind of a big deal, because while RE2, RE3, and RE4 certainly changed things from their original versions, the core story beats generally remain the same. But this time, Veronica sounds different. According to Capcom, scenes won't necessarily be cut, but many of them will be shifted around, reimagined, expanded, and transformed into something new. In fact, Yoshiaki specifically described their approach as being more aggressive than previous remakes. And that raises a pretty interesting question. Why is Veronica the game they're willing to take the biggest risks with? Personally, I think the answer comes down to the original game itself. As beloved as Code Veronica is, it's also one of the most divisive entries in the series. The game has some incredible ideas, but it also suffers from pacing issues, some questionable character writing, and story moments that haven't exactly aged gracefully. And from the sounds of it, Capcom isn't interested in simply polishing those rough edges. They want to completely rework them. Which brings us to another huge reveal. For the first time, Capcom has openly stated that Veronica is being designed first and foremost as Claire's story. Now that might sound obvious at first, but if you played Code Veronica, you'll know the game eventually shifts a huge amount of attention toward Chris, Wesker, and the larger conflict surrounding Umbrella. This time around, Capcom seems determined to keep Claire at the center of everything. They specifically emphasized that she is the main character, the story is focused on her, and that despite the events of RE2 making her more experienced and mentally resilient, she won't suddenly become some overpowered action hero. Interestingly, Capcom also talked about the gameplay direction they're taking with Claire. According to the interviews, Veronica is being designed much closer to Resident Evil 2 remake than Resident Evil 4. Capcom repeatedly emphasized that Veronica is first and foremost a survival horror game. Resources will be limited, and the focus is being placed on tension, exploration, and survival rather than action. Honestly, I think that's exactly the right approach, because while Code Veronica certainly had its action-packed moments, at its core it was always a survival horror game. Resource management was crucial, backtracking could be dangerous, and making the wrong decision with an item could come back to haunt you hours later. In fact, Capcom even confirmed that inventory management will once again play an important role, which should be welcome news for fans who prefer the slower, more methodical style of Resident Evil. And considering the developers behind both RE2 and RE4 remakes are leading this project, it seems like they're taking the tension and atmosphere of RE2 while using everything they've learned over the last several remakes to create the definitive version of Veronica. Another question Capcom finally put to rest was the camera perspective. If you remember the reveal trailer, a lot of people walked away questioning if Veronica would feature a first-person mode, similar to RE Village or Requiem. But according to the game's producer, that isn't the case. The first-person sequences were created specifically for the trailer and do not represent the actual gameplay experience. In fact, Capcom confirmed that Veronica is a third-person game only, and honestly, I think that's gonna make a lot of fans happy. Now, while the gameplay details are exciting, the thing that stood out to me the most wasn't the gameplay at all. It was Capcom's comments about the game's central theme, because for the first time, they openly talked about what kind of horror Veronica is built around. According to the producer, every RE game focuses on a different type of horror. Some focus on isolation, some focus on body horror, and others focus on overwhelming odds and survival. But Veronica is different. Capcom says this game's horror comes from the darkness inside people's hearts and minds, and more specifically, love pushed too far. Now at first, that might sound like a strange way to describe an RE game, but the more you think about it, the more it starts to make sense. Because when you look back at Code Veronica, that theme is everywhere. The most obvious example is Alfred and Alexia Ashford, a relationship built on obsession, dependency, and an inability to let go. A love so unhealthy that it completely destroys Alfred's sense of reality. And based on Capcom's comments, it sounds like they're planning to lean much harder into that side of his character this time around. In fact, when asked directly about Alfred, the producer specifically mentioned wanting to explore the darkness in his heart that stems from his love, which tells me they're not looking at Alfred as some over-the-top villain from an old Dreamcast game. They're looking at him as a tragic and deeply disturbed person. And honestly, I think that's exactly what this remake needs. Because if there's one character in Code Veronica that could benefit from additional depth and development, it would be Alfred Ashford. But the interesting thing is that this theme extends far beyond just Alfred. You can see it in Steve Burnside's relationship with Claire. You can see it in Alexia. You can see it in Claire's determination to find Chris. And you can even see it in Chris himself, who travels halfway across the world to rescue his sister. Almost every major storyline in Code Veronica is driven by some form of love, loyalty, obsession, or devotion. Some healthy, and some incredibly destructive. And if Capcom is rebuilding the remake around that central theme, it suddenly makes a lot more sense why they're willing to make such major changes to the story and characters. Because they aren't just trying to modernize Code Veronica, they're trying to strengthen what they believe the story was always about in the first place. Another detail that immediately caught my attention was Capcom's comment about Rockfort Island itself, because according to the interviews, we're gonna be seeing much more about the people who actually lived there before the outbreak. And honestly, that's something the original game never really experienced. By the time Claire arrives on the island, the damage has already been done. The zombies are everywhere, the prison is in chaos, and most of the island's residents are already dead. You spend the entire game exploring the aftermath of a disaster rather than witnessing the disaster itself. But now, it sounds like Capcom wants to flesh that part of the story out, whether that means additional files, environmental storytelling, flashbacks, or entirely new scenes remains to be seen. But personally, I think this is one of the smartest changes they could make, especially when you consider just how important the island is to the overall story. Now there's one more detail from these interviews that I think deserves a lot more attention. And honestly, it might end up being one of the biggest reveals of them all. When discussing the game's story, Capcom mentioned that Veronica won't just connect to previous RE titles. It will also contain ties to future games in the series, including RE9. In fact, the producer specifically referenced a new through line being added to the remake that leads fairly directly into Requiem. And that's a pretty interesting statement, because the way Capcom talks about this remake, it almost feels like they're treating it less like a remake and more like an opportunity to strengthen the overall timeline. And honestly, it makes a lot of sense. Code Veronica has always occupied a unique place in the series. It's the game that fully reintroduces Wesker and explores the legacy of Umbrella, and it helps bridge that gap between the classic era of Resident Evil and everything that came after. So if Capcom is looking for a place to plant seeds for future stories, Veronica is actually a pretty logical choice. Now as for what this new through line could be, that's where things get interesting. Personally, my mind immediately goes toward the connections. Ever since Resident Evil 7, Capcom has been slowly building them up behind the scenes. We learn more about them in Village and Requiem. We know they were involved in Evelyn's creation, and they've gradually become one of the most important organizations in the modern timeline. So it wouldn't surprise me at all if Capcom used Veronica to retroactively strengthen their presence within the series. Another possibility is Xeno and some of the newer lore introduced around Requiem, especially since Capcom specifically mentioned a connection to the future rather than the past. But at this point, we're really entering speculation territory. What matters most is that Capcom felt the need to mention it at all, because if Veronica truly contains new story elements that directly lead into Requiem, then this remake may end up being much more important to the franchise than most people realize. It might not just be revisiting the past, it could be helping shape the future of Resident Evil as well. So after going through all these interviews, I think one thing has become pretty clear. Capcom isn't approaching Veronica the same way they approached their previous remakes, because when you look at everything they've talked about, the story changes, the expanded lore, the focus on Claire, the psychological themes, the survival horror gameplay, and even the connections to Requiem, it starts to feel like they're treating Veronica as much more than a remake. They're treating it like a major Resident Evil title, and honestly, that's exactly what this game deserves. For years, Code Veronica has existed in this strange spot within the franchise. It's one of the most important games in the entire timeline. It's the game that brings back Wesker, the game that further develops Claire and Chris, and the game that explores the Ashford family and the T. Veronica virus. Yet despite all of that, it's also a game that many fans would admit had plenty of room for improvement. And from the sounds of it, Capcom isn't afraid to tackle those issues head on. They're not just updating the graphics, they're not just modernizing the gameplay. They're looking at the story, the characters, the themes, and even the world itself, and asking how can they make it all stronger. Now whether every single change lands remains to be seen, but I have to admit, the more Capcom talks about this project, the more excited I get. But let me know what you guys think. What's your biggest takeaway from these interviews? Are you most excited about the survival horror gameplay, the expanded focus on Claire, or the possibility that Veronica could help shape the future of the Resident Evil timeline? Something tells me we're only scratching the surface of what this remake has in store, and honestly, I can't wait to see what Capcom reveals next. And if you want a full story recap on Claire Redfield before this game drops, then be sure to click this video here. But thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.